If I may have your attention a few minutes just to say a warm welcome to Dr. Johnson's house. My name is Celine and I'm the curator here of Dr. Johnson's house. It's a pleasure to welcome some new faces here today, but also some very familiar ones as well. Firstly, I want to thank again our Fleet Street Quarter Business Improvement District, who is the sponsor of our lunchtime lecture series. It's been a wonderful series, and each month the tickets are sold out, so it's great that you're supporting us this way as a museum and hopefully as a local community endeavour for people in the area too, to learn more about the history of Gough Square, the history of Samuel Johnson, the 18th century, but very much beyond that too as well, to looking at broader London history and matters that are pertinent to this day as well. Which leads me very much to today's speaker. Professor Sheila Kavanagh. Some of you will know her if you've been a regular follower of our exhibition programmes and events. Sheila's long been involved with the house here. She's Professor of English in Emory College in Georgia. She is fresh off an aeroplane this morning from Georgia. So yes, she deserves a particular round of applause on behalf of the house, but very much personally as well, for joining us straight from the airport to be with us today to talk about our current exhibition, which she worked on and led, which is Gratifications of the Palate. It's in the room directly beneath us, opposite the library. If you haven't had a chance to visit before the lecture today, do make a point of doing so afterwards. I'm sure, if you forgive the pun, Sheila will whet your appetite to do so. Yes, so Sheila has worked on a number of exhibitions. At the back of the room, you'll see her previous work. It was a study of the custodians and curators of the 20th century of the house here. And her particular expertise, there are too many to list here, but focus really on Shakespeare and on social history and on bringing academic work and research very much to the forefront of public engagement, public delivery, in a way that actually has real resonance and meaning to people outside of the ivory towers. And I think she's really to be applauded globally, far beyond the bounds of Georgia and Emory University, for the work that she does. So without further ado, if you don't mind joining me again in a rapturous applause in welcoming her. Thank you.
Thank you to Celine and Dr. Johnson's house, and for everyone who's here. Also, a lot of the materials in the exhibition are from the Guildhall Library, and the chief librarian, Peter Ross, was very instrumental in helping get a lot of the materials that are here. That was one of the things that was very exciting, to have things both from the house and from outside of the house. So anyway, I want to talk, and I decided that instead of doing slides, I would do the old-fashioned thing, and I would show you books, because then I thought that you could see some of the other things that were available, so that when you leave here today with nothing on your mind but 18th century food, you don't have to worry about, what am I going to read? I'll have told you what you're going to read, and you'll all be ready with your sandwiches. But the exhibit is in 4 sections, but I want to start with a couple of things that are not in the exhibition. And that is that the exhibition is both foods and beverages. Now, one beverage that is famous from this time period is gin. And the gin craze, as you know, would take up an entire exhibition on its own. And so I thought, we'll just leave gin to the side. But there's a couple of things that I almost included, and I have some regret that I didn't. So I thought I'd tell you about them, because I had some images and I went back and forth. One is orgeat, which is a mixture of pounded Jordan and bitter almonds. They were mixed with spring water and rose water and put in a sieve until the almonds dried. What I learned yesterday, by the way, is none of my students, who are very bright undergraduates, have any idea what a sieve is. That's something that apparently no longer exists in their brains. A clarified syrup was then mixed with the almonds and boiled, and it was added to water. And apparently it is, at least sometimes, used today in Mai Tais. So there are some drinks that have continued. The other one, and is Salop, which Salop was really popular. And it was particularly popular because it was cheaper than coffee and tea, which were very expensive. And it was made, it came, a lot of it was from the Ottoman Empire, but it was often made either from sassafras leaves, which were from North America, or from orchids. And they mixed it up. The plant sort of made it a thicker drink, and it had a stimulant quality. So if you couldn't afford coffee or tea, it was a great substitute. And it was used as a remedy for various ailments, including, I have absolutely no idea what this condition might be, but it's called chronic alcoholic inebriety. So apparently if you drank this, it would help keep you from other things. But the reason that it declined in popularity was partly because the price of coffee and tea dropped. But it became known as a remedy for venereal disease. And so people no longer wanted to drink it in public because it would cast aspersions on their reputation. And so they took out Salop stalls and put in coffee and stalls instead. So anyway, another thing that almost made it into the exhibition, and a lot of the images are from the London Metropolitan Archives, and there was a wonderful image that we just could never get the contrast correct, so we couldn't include it. But, and some of you may know that about this, but up until something like 1925, you could go to St. James's Park where they'd have a lot of milk cows and buy a cup of milk. And we had an image of that we wanted to include, and as I say, the contrast didn't work. But as far as I know, since I just got off the plane, I haven't been to St. James's today, but I suspect that you may not be able to get a cup of milk there today. But anyway, so the exhibit is in 4 sections. The first, as those of you who are regulars at Dr. Johnson's house may well be aware, that through Dr. Johnson's close friends, the Thrales, they had strong connections with the Anchor Brewing Company. And so downstairs in the exhibit, we've actually got a chair that's from the brewing company. We've got James Boswell's beer mug, although when you look at it, it is so dainty, it's hard to believe that that was his everyday go-to beer mug. I mean, it's really very, and one of the books with tavern food, because inns and taverns were very popular, as you know. And this is some of the materials from this is the Tavern Cook 18th Century Dining through the recipes of Richard Briggs. So this was and he was a tavern cook at the time and in the neighborhood. And so in this book, he provides a lot of the recipes and things like that. So it's a wonderful resource to have. There's also part of the exhibit is on coffee and tea. And again, we're very fortunate. We've got part of Mrs. Thrale's tea set, and we've got part of Sir Joshua Reynolds' tea set. And they're in the exhibition downstairs. As you may know, Sir Joshua Reynolds was a very close friend and part of the group that Johnson and Boswell brought around them. And they're really lovely artifacts. Tea became increasingly popular during this time because the tax on tea. Now, as an American, we've heard a lot about taxes on teas, but we hear it from a slightly different perspective. But the tax on tea here was 110%. And then it got dropped to about 23%. And that's when tea took off as being something people would drink. So you didn't even have to push it into the Thames. You could just, afford to buy it. And coffee became incredibly popular, as you know. So there were coffee houses everywhere, mostly exclusively for men. And Boswell talks a lot about the importance of going to coffee shops and things and talking to people, and what was talked about was often as important as what they were drinking. The other thing, though, and this is one of the reasons why it's really nice that we have the tea set from Mrs. Thrale and from Sir Joshua Reynolds, is because for a very long time, and many of these are Chinese artifacts, but China figured out how to make what we would now think of the iconic teacup long before anybody in Europe could do so. And it was a very complicated process that nobody could quite figure out. And so porcelain and things came in during this time, and as coffee and tea became more and more common, but that also allowed people to not just rely on China and to have our, and as you know, there's a lot of porcelain made in the UK, but that came after, or made in England, I apologize. Then there's a section on street food, and I really wanted to have something on street food because I think a lot of people forget that if you were poor in particular, you probably didn't have a kitchen. A kitchen would take too much room, it would be too much money, and you'd be out working all the time. And I think that probably the most memorable reminder of that we get is from slightly later. But in A Christmas Carol, you've got Ebenezer Scrooge who picks up food that he brings home to eat. And then he also talks about that he doesn't really believe in the ghosts, that it must have been a piece of bad cheese that he picked up. But there was a lot of street food, and there's a brand new book called Street Food. If you can't remember the name, just think about the topic. And there's a piece in the part in the exhibit, and a lot of that is drawn from Henry Mayhew's, where he's talking about the poor people in London. And for a lot of them, street food would be the food that was available, and some of it would be cooked things, some of it would be things that they would, just take, getting apples and things like that. And during the day, there's a lot of the images that are in the exhibit are from the Cries of London. And there's several collections of the Cries of London. And a lot of tracking it, because during different times of the day, people would be calling out different things that they were selling. And so some of it was cooked, so you could get pea soup was very popular, or we've got an image downstairs of fritters, or other kind of baked goods, which had a dual advantage, because if they were cooking things on the street, it would be warm right where they were cooking things. And so you could not only get something to eat, but you could warm up for a moment. And you could tell what time of day it was based on what they were calling out. So the cries of London was when they were making the cries for what was available. One of the things that I include in the exhibit is, Celine said that we would gather around Hodge if the house burns down. So I hope that instead of the house burning down, that you all just say hello to Hodge on the way out. But I particularly wanted to include an oyster cellar in the Cries of London. Dr. Johnson claimed that he always bought the oysters for Hodge himself because he didn't want his staff to feel put upon by Hodge, and they wanted, and so he got them himself. But there's also some other things that are in the exhibit that, again, as those of you who know London history would know very well, but today, for example, eels were incredibly popular for a very long time, and so eels are included. Some other things like that we wouldn't necessarily have today. And then there's another section on what people ate at home and what people ate when they entertain. And there's this book here that it was published in the early 20th century, but this is James Woodford, The Diary of a Country Parson, 1758 to 1802. He wrote down every meal he ever consumed. Now, I don't know whether that's all he talked about or whether he just kept a record of it, but for something like this, it's an incredible resource. Now, if you said to your family, I'm writing down every meal I eat for the rest of my life, they'd probably have you put away. But it really is wonderful to have this because we get a real sense of what the food was, who was preparing it, who he was eating with, etc. So it really is an extraordinary resource, however quirky. Because as you may know, over time, what people eat changes. That there's going to be things where it's going to be local food that's going to be seasonal, and then as trade routes come in or as tastes change, what you're eating, and then obviously later on when different kinds of processing came in. And so it's valuable to get a sense. And you can see in the exhibit downstairs some of the things that were changing at this time. For example, the books are open to recipes that you wouldn't necessarily expect. One, going back to the coffee and tea exhibit, is we've got a recipe for coffee ice cream, which you wouldn't think that Samuel Johnson was noshing down on coffee ice cream. I don't know whether he ate any himself, but it existed. There's also recipes that we might have heard of ourselves, like kebabs, and recipes for Indian curries and things like that. So that this is a time where a lot of those things were infiltrating into the recipes. I don't know if you know anything about medieval cookbooks or early modern cookbooks, but they typically give you so little information that you sometimes wonder why bother. So it will say add liquid. Won't tell you how much, won't tell you what liquid. Sometimes that's because the people who are, they're assuming a certain level of expertise. And sometimes it's based on what do you have around the house. So that what liquid could be, you can't let anything go to waste. So you might have an egg white, and then tomorrow you've got some milk, and the next day you've got some ale. And so what you use depends on what's there. At this time, a lot of people were bringing in staff who were doing, so we've gone from the poorer people now to the wealthier people, of course. And the cookbooks, therefore, are incredibly detailed. They tell you everything you could possibly need to know. And what they're doing is making sure that if you have staff who are being trained or haven't been fully trained, they obviously need to be literate, or somebody who's working with them has to be literate. But it will tell you every inch of everything, of what needs to be done, in what order, etc., etc. There's also, as you see, we'll see downstairs, there are lots of cookbooks that tell you exactly how to put a meal together depending on what the season is. And so there's lots of menus. There's nothing really left to chance. You can find out wherever you are in terms of your knowledge of food. And it can be fancy food or less fancy food. You know, they still have the exotic things that are created to look like something else, you know, sort of like hedgehog cakes and all that kind of stuff. But also just step by step by step by step by step. And often they'll be presented by writers who had worked in very noble families and households and things like that. And so they'll be marketed as, you know, I worked for Lord so-and-so, and with my book, you can eat like Lord so-and-so did. So, and the one part, this is where Celine is going to shout at me, but we'll just ignore that. So there is one thing that did not get included in the exhibit, which I had wanted to include it, but someone, I don't know if you're familiar with a lexicographer named Samuel Johnson. Well, there were several female cookbook authors at this time, like Hannah Glass is one of the famous ones. And Dr. Johnson pronounced that if he wrote a cookbook, it would be the best cookbook ever. And that a woman really shouldn't write a cookbook, that he should write a cookbook. And boy, would it be the best. Now, as far as we know, he never wrote a cookbook. And so we don't know whether it's the best or not. But the other thing that you'll see downstairs is we have a number of images. So that's sort of the cases in the exhibit and then the images above the exhibit. And we're in an anniversary year for Johnson and Boswell's trip to the Hebrides. And a lot of what we're not exclusively, but what those are looking at are when they went to Scotland. And Dr. Johnson had, I wouldn't say a love-hate, but there were things he loved about Scottish food and things that he did not. And Boswell had been trying to get Johnson to go to Scotland for a very long time and was extremely excited when he went there. And in these images, you learn several things. One, going back to tea, Samuel Johnson apparently could drink more tea at one sitting than any person on the planet. And a lot of Mrs. Boswell apparently was very gracious about that. Many of his hostesses were not. He had the proverbial wooden, empty leg that was just, and they would get very frustrated with him. But one of the things that Boswell was trying to do was Scotify his palate. And so there are some images there about that. There's also a book I don't have here, but Virginia McLean, who's done this book on culinary history, has a book about what they ate while they were in Scotland. What Johnson really liked about Scottish food was breakfast. He thought that they had, they ate more different kinds of jams and things like that. And so he thought Scottish breakfasts were just wonderful. Except people there were trying to convince him that he should have a sheep's head for breakfast. And Dr. Johnson demurred. He decided that he was not going to have a sheep's head. However, we do have a recipe for sheep's head soup. So if any of you want to try that at home, and when they have, there are often private parties that are here in the house, and Celine has assured me that if anybody wants to rent the space and serve sheep's head soup, they are very welcome. So I have to admit I've never had it, but, we had no discussion about whether we were going to serve sheep's head for lunch today. And a number of there's images of Johnson and Boswell together, and then some of the other people who are relevant, like the Thrales and such. Basically, if you're one of the people who's read much of Johnson or Boswell, you know that mealtime was incredibly important. And both the food and the conversation. And their texts are filled with discussions about where they ate, who they ate with, and who they were talking to and what they were talking about. So it oftentimes it looks as though that's kind of what they did. Went from one place to another to another. Although with Boswell, you do get a sense of his sometimes economic, precarity. Because there are times he talks about what he eats when he has money, and he talks about what he eats when he doesn't have money. And so that also runs through that. And obviously with Boswell, when he's talking about when he's out and about, there's regularly women involved, but that's a whole different exhibit that I'm not sure we'll ever do. But anyway, I'm hoping that it will interest you to get a sense. We've tried to put also a lot of information here, so that there are things that you can look at in the exhibit, but then also read about more. And that's why I thought that I would bring some of the books so that you can go off and start your own Eating with Dr. Johnson book club. And before I turn to Q&A, to let you know that Tina Baxter is here today from the Georgian Dining Academy, and the Georgian Dining Academy is hosting a tea at the house in honor of Dr. Johnson's birthday on the 17th of September. So if you want to come and drink tea, I don't know whether Dr. Johnson will arrive or not, but unexpected guests sometimes do. But you can get tickets on the website, the Dr. Johnson's website. So anyway, are there questions, comments? Yes?
When Dr. Johnson was living here, what did they do about drinking water?
Drinking water, that I think my understanding, and I know this is going to be a wobbly answer, is that a lot of what we have always been taught about the purity of water, and it's the same with the purity of meat, is wrong, and that's all being reconsidered. And so I'm not sure that I can give you an up to the moment what the answer is about that now. Because for so long it was always said people drank beer because the water was impure. And scholars recently are saying that that's not true. And people also said that the reason that spicy food became so popular was because it covered up the meat that had gone off. They're saying now that that's not true either.
It was the influence of French food, something that came after Dr. Johnson's time.
Yeah, and there's a number of the books include things from France. So, there certainly was a lot of, for centuries, people had access to various recipes and cooks and things like that. So nothing, the food that they talk about doesn't resonate as French, but certainly French food was available and known about. So. They didn't. But, and again, a lot of the things, as things were changing and what became available and what people could afford, etc., shifted. And socioeconomically, I mean, the difference between what the wealthy people were eating and what the rest of the people were eating was dramatically different. But eel pie, and I don't know whether anybody, I have been trying, not full time, but I have been trying to discern whether King Charles ate any of the lamprey pie that was prepared for his coronation. And nobody's been able to verify whether he actually ate it. No, the quiche was the dish they created. But there's a tradition that a lamprey pie is prepared for the monarch. There was one made for his mother and one made for him, but nobody seems to know whether he ate it or not. But that's one of the traditions.
There somewhere. We'll look for it.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, and since the coronation was so recent, it will really be tasty. So...
super. Well, I think unless there are any more sort of immediate questions, there's little remains to say other than an enormous thank you to Sheila for taking us through the sort of the public spheres, the inns, the taverns, the culture of dining and drinking, right through to the street food. I mean, we're all familiar with that in the very many food markets that pop up here and there, but very historic precedents for that too, and the much more domestic setting too, in terms of the wonderful exquisite recipes that might have been available to the rather more questionable sheep head soup ones, but also pointing out some of the really universal truths, like the absolute distinguishing factor of money to satisfy and gratify the palate. There is a wonderful book that Sheila will be producing very eminently. Would you remind me of the title of it? All about the subject of food and food culture.
That doesn't have a title yet.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
A work in process.
It's the other book.
Watch this space. Well, I'll absolutely let you know once that's hot off the press, / book launch here at the house. But thank you also for mentioning the fact that you too could join us here in Dr. Johnson's house for your very own tea party and luncheon later in September the 17th. Do let myself or Tina know if you're interested in that. Otherwise, I'll just leave you with one of Johnson's food for thought. Again, my second pun of the talk, do indulge me, which was that, the cucumber, yes. Johnson said the best thing that you can do with cucumber really is to dress it, slice it, and then promptly throw it away. He, like myself, is not a fan of cucumber. But he did really mind his belly. He said, for my part, I mind my belly very much, and he who does not mind his belly will hardly mind anything else. So on that note, I hope you have enjoyed not just your luncheon lecture here with Sheila, but also the lunch that was provided beforehand. And please do have a look around the house and visit the exhibit Gratifications of the Palate below before you leave. Thank you very much for joining us today, and join me in thanking Sheila.